We just passed the 30-year mark of Timothy McVeigh's terrorist act of right wing violence in which he bombed the government building in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma on April 19th, 1995. To commemorate that anniversary, we got two new documentary features. On Netflix, we got Oklahoma City Bombing, American Terror, and on Disney Plus and Hulu, we got a National Geographic produced Oklahoma City Bombing, One Day in America, part of a larger One Day in America series. While these two productions have different lengths, the Netflix documentary is only 90 minutes, whereas the National Geographic production is three parts of about an hour each. They actually emphasize much of the same storylines, focus, and framing. They focus on the day itself and the immediate aftermath and investigation. They emphasize the heroism of those who acted on that day, as well as the bravery of the broader community who refused to be defined by the terrorism. And they frame McVeigh as a radical and exceptionalist terrorist, juxtaposed with the common humanity that most people share. A lot of those impulses I fully sympathize with and believe are quite smart. However, I think in these two shows and the broader national understanding of the Oklahoma City bombing, we're missing a core lesson. Let's dig in. But first, I want to give the two documentaries their due because they really do have a lot of strengths. They centered their stories on the victims, like Amy Downs, who appears in both features. She was working for the bank when she was buried alive and had to be dug out hours later becoming the CEO of that credit union. Or people like Renee Moore, who lost her infant child, Antonio Cooper, an unfathomable tragedy, and her ability to speak on the issue was quite moving. She appeared in the Netflix documentary. Both productions demonstrate the tremendous strength of the communities that refuse to be defined by the tragedy, but instead continue to move forward and find a sense of commonality and universal communion that I found quite powerful. Both productions have great access to interviews and footage, not only interviewing a lot of the key figures from the day itself, but the National Geographic documentary received extensive footage from the OKC-based KWTV News 9, which allowed them to go behind the scenes to capture how the news crew was uncovering the elements of that day, and that made it quite riveting. The National Geographic doc also had extensive interviews with politicians like the governor of Oklahoma at the time, as well as Bill Clinton, who was the president at the time. I appreciate these focuses because they displace Timothy McVeigh from the narrative, not allowing him to have the pinnacle part of the story, which is often so problematic in media depictions of tragic events. I also want to note that both documentaries make what I think is a moving and smart decision to give a lot of space toward the end of their productions to parents of children who died during the terrorist act who are speaking out against capital punishment. Talking about how, in the case of Renee Moore, she says that Timothy McVeigh did not deserve to be able to get out that easy and not have to suffer for the lifetime of crimes. Whereas in the National Geographic doc, they interview a father who talks about how his daughter, who was killed in the tragedy, was anti-capital punishment, and he fulfilled her desires and continued to speak out against the inhumanity of the death penalty. And as someone who is filming this video from Huntsville, Texas, the capital punishment capital of the capital punishment capital of the world, I think those messages are quite crucial, and those are the right voices to be giving them. So I really appreciated those elements of these documentaries. Unfortunately, I did come away frustrated with the limitations of this framing that was found in both of these productions. Both of these shows really narrow in on the day of the tragedy itself and how McVeigh's terrorism was exceptional and a one-off and does not really have much of a connection to the broader human world. And I get the idea, again, of trying to displace McVeigh and emphasize the heroes of the story. But that exceptionalist framing of McVeigh's actions, I believe, downplays the larger lessons and, importantly, the broader community that McVeigh represented. Lessons that I believe are all the more relevant today than they've ever been. Only 5 minutes of the Netflix documentary are devoted to the broader right-wing extremism ecosystem that made McVeigh possible. They barely mention the background of Waco. There's a very brief discussion of the Turner Diaries, but again, in the 130 minutes of runtime, there's only about 5 minutes devoted to the right-wing extremism. The National Geographic three-part series is even more the case. I think they devote less than 5 minutes. The only interest in Waco is when they're talking about the news crew when they are discovering the connections that the Oklahoma City bombing was taking place on the second anniversary of the Waco siege, and them realizing, oh my gosh, this might be domestic terrorism and not someone in the Middle East. They emphasize that those who saw Waco as a call to war were limited in number and were a fringe group. And then you have the lawyer Stephen Jones, who is a key talking head in the National Geographic documentary, who emphasized that McVeigh vacuumed up the anger and resentment of the community and is able to present it in a seemingly exceptionalist way rather than reflecting how many people vacuumed up that anger and resentment. The National Geographic documentary, by the way, doesn't even give the name to McVeigh's accomplice, Terry Nichols, let alone mention that there might have been a broader conspiracy. Now, this framing fits into modern media's approach to true crime documentaries, which often focus on the tragedy of the victims, and again, I fully sympathize with this, as well as the exceptional nature of those who are committing the crime, and juxtaposing the inhumanity of McVeigh to the humanity and the strength of the community. But again, I think this is missing a broader story, that the right-wing extremist violent culture that enabled and propelled McVeigh only grew after 1995. And if we don't make those connections, we're losing that larger picture. Let me explain what I mean. In Kathleen Belew's excellent book that I strongly recommend, Bring the War Home, The White Power Movement and Paramilitary America, she talks about the generation of which McVeigh was a part that is much more widespread. Those who had military experience became disillusioned with the government and federal oversight, reacted to the progressive gains of the culture wars, and ended up deciding that a radical conspiratorial mindset of opposing the government was the only solution, a rejection of not just progressive policies, but the establishment, and that this anti-government crescendo led to a lot of violent impulses. One of the best textual embodiments of this new way of thinking was a book authored by William Luther Pierce titled The Turner Diaries, which had a pseudonym given because Pierce did not want to be identified with the book for several decades. This book posited a future race war in this fictional world in which the white supremacists gather together to oppose this Jewish-led, racially inclusive, federally oppressive government. And people like Timothy McVeigh took a lot of lessons from these Turner Diaries, which sold hundreds of thousands of copies during these decades. In fact, McVeigh himself traveled the nation to different gun shows selling copies of the Turner Diaries and recommending the book to anyone who would listen. In fact, when he was arrested the day of the bombing, pages of the Turner Diaries were found in his car. This was a much broader context than just a one-off individual. Pierce's book, The Turner Diaries, was a cultural touchstone that inspired many. And one of the historical events that prompted these people who were acting on the ideas in the Turner Diaries, like McVeigh, was the government's siege on Waco on April 19th, 1993, dealing with a religious group that they deemed a nuisance and a violent cult that was harboring weapons and destroying people's consciousness and well-being, and This resulted in a multi-week standoff. I strongly recommend. There's been a number of really good documentaries and books on Waco. But to those conspiracy-minded individuals like McVeigh, like those reading the Turner Diaries, they saw this as confirmation that the federal government was out to deprive them of their rights, to take away their guns. McVeigh himself traveled to Waco during the siege, selling his anti-government bumper stickers, where he found lots of fellow colleagues in this cause. He later said in his interviews with Stephen Jones, his lawyer, that Waco started the war. And Waco ever since has been a dog whistle for conservative politics to denounce the federal government's intervention. Donald Trump himself launched his most recent presidential campaign at a rally in Waco in which he denounced the federal government for being out to get him, a direct echo of the type of mythology attached to Waco among these conservative conspiratorial thinking. But those weren't the only points of influence for McVeigh and this broader anti-government, militant, violent conservative culture. This was the time when right-wing radio and 24-hour news media were further confirming the conspiracies that the government was evil, out to get you, and must be opposed. McVeigh, as he traveled across the nation in his car, was a devout listener to Rush Limbaugh. This was a growing conservative ecosystem that was encouraging people to see each other as the enemy, not just with Rush Limbaugh on radio, but Newt Gingrich in Congress, Pat Buchanan on TV. This was a call to battle that McVeigh was taking literally. McVeigh mentioned these influences in detail during his interviews with his lawyer, Stephen Jones. And it was the passing of the assault's weapon ban that was the final straw for McVeigh to decide to move out. Now, sadly, these broader lessons get lost when we talk about McVeigh as an exceptionalist figure. And in many ways, the counter myth of McVeigh being a one-off and an extreme version who did not have broader cultural connections was molded in the moment. The guy who led the federal investigation was none other than Merrick Garland, later a DC District Court judge, and then the Attorney General under Joe Biden, who zeroed in on McVeigh and his immediate accomplices like Terry Nichols, and ignoring the broader connections of people who likely helped him plan and pull off the affair. And perhaps more complicit was Bill Clinton, the Democratic president at the time, who was often under siege by Republican opposition, who tried to present himself as a moderate. And one of the ways he presented himself as a moderate was publicly dismissing all the connections of Timothy McVeigh to a broader conservative culture, giving statements saying that attempts to connect McVeigh to right-wing talk radio, despite McVeigh making those connections himself, but all those attempts to connect McVeigh to right-wing talk radio were unfounded. So a way for him to burnish his moderate credentials, but in a way that moderation meant overlooking the larger lessons. Because one of the sad ironies, and indeed tragedies from this, is that McVeigh's anti-government, conspiratorial, and radical extremism within a couple of decades became mainstream within right-wing America. The only thing that McVeigh was missing in 1995 that enables people like the Proud Boys and the Three Percenters and those who are fulfilling the visions that McVeigh had of them organizing together is now they have social media that enable them to talk much easier than McVeigh, who had to literally travel the nation to gun conventions to find similarly minded people. So McVeigh was part of the same cultural currents that produced people like the Proud Boys and other right-wing militia groups that are now being supported and enabled by the right-wing ecosystem. The January 6th insurrection is just another chapter in that larger story, and we don't see that relevance, the connection between McVeigh's act of terror and today's multitude acts of terror, as long as we try to present McVeigh as just an exceptionalist one-off. And that's an example of where history is missing. Hope you enjoyed this video. Please like and share with others. I've done previous videos on modern media and American history and pop culture. Make sure to see my analysis on Daredevil and Catholicism, or my previous work on the Jody Hildebrand and Ruby Franke and Devil in the Family. I believe that it's important to provide this historical background to our modern day media fascinations, because otherwise we're missing the broader picture. And I think many of you see that way as well.